the police came in and they determined that Dexter was one of these banned breeds, had Dexter put to sleep. And then less than a week later, we had the biological mother of Dexter come in, Misty, who was clearly, similar type of dog because Dexter was their offspring. And the police came in, looked at Misty, and they determined that she was not a banned breed. Even though visually they looked almost identical, same color, same shaped head, similar size, obviously a bit older, graying potentially, but equally lovely. And she got to live. And that speaks to the arbitrary nature of this.
Order! Order! Order!
Hello and welcome to Not to Get Political, the podcast where we delve into the world of politics and hope to remain unscathed. Today we're going to be talking about the government's ban on XL Bullies, a dog breed that's got everyone talking after a string of attacks involving them. The government has decided to ban the breed in response, but what is the correct approach? To discuss this with me today is Representative Robert from Animal Rising. Robert, thank you so much for joining me. We originally wanted to do this as a debate with someone pro-ban and then someone who was anti-ban, but unfortunately, the anti-ban side aren't doing any media appearances at the moment because they've been receiving death threats. Does that kind of show us where this debate has gone?
I'm surprised and disappointed to hear that, but I can somewhat understand that this is a very polarized issue. This is a very emotional issue. No one should be sending death threats. And I think it's a shame, especially if it's preventing us from having this debate today. So I'll do my best not to be too one-sided.
So, let's get into it. So why do you think the government is introducing measures to ban XL bullies?
I think very simply, it's the same reason they brought in the original Dangerous Dog Act in 1991, and that was a very reactionary piece of legislation that government wanted to look like they were doing something to prevent dog attacks, which are obviously often quite high profile in the media, quite polarizing. And so they brought in this what is called breed specific legislation that bans certain breeds. So and originally it banned 4 breeds, and now following a string of XL bully attacks, they're adding XL bullies to this ineffective reactionary legislation in reforming it, which I think is a real shame.
Okay. So according to XL Bully Watch, there's been 14 deaths involving an XL bully dog. There's been 351 documented attacks involving large bully breeds this year alone. This is from 2023. 43% of dog attacks in 2023 have involved an XL bully, and there has been a 435% increase in dog attacks since 2013. So surely this means that something does need to be done about this breed, no?
Well, whichever side of the fence you sit on, if you agree something does need to be done, I think it's fair to say that um, adding to what is already an ineffective piece of legislation isn't going to solve the issue. So, for example, since the original Dangerous Dog Act was brought in, we've only seen an increase in hospitalization from dog bites, an increase in incidences of dog bites, and an increase in fatalities from dog attacks. So banning an additional breed isn't going to solve the problem, unfortunately. And so I think what it comes down to is going and talking to the experts, looking at uh, developing a scientific approach rather than an emotional reactionary approach to solve what is a serious issue. Not necessarily with one breed, obviously, the stats from 2023 were heavily stunted or tilted in one direction. But between, for example, 1989 and 2017, 48 people died from dog-related attacks. And of those, only 50, of those, the majority of breeds significantly involved in those attacks were not on the prohibited list. So what it comes back to is the fact that breeds don't determine aggression and that it's a much more complex issue. And this is what all of the leading dog behavioralists, all of the leading dog organizations are trying to tell the government.
So, with the Dangerous Dogs Act, as you mentioned, I assume you were referring to the 1991 original piece of legislation, yes? What you said that it's ineffectual. Why is it ineffectual?
That's a really good question. And it all comes back to this idea that breed is aggressive rather than an individual, and looking at their character. So the original legislation, just like it will apply to XL bullies soon, it ban certain breeds from being rehomed. So when they end up in shelters, they inevitably end up being euthanized. But those people who get exemptions through the courts, they have to follow certain rules and procedures, like they have to have the dog neutered, microchipped, they have to wear a muzzle when they're out and about, they need to buy third-party insurance, all of which potentially are good measures. But what it comes back to is the fact that it hasn't reduced dog attacks, it hasn't reduced dog bites, it hasn't reduced fatalities, and potentially, well, the leading experts are telling us there are much better things we could do to address that. One of the big things being educating people more on dog behavior, educating them on why dogs are aggressive and what leads to aggression, and certainly how to avoid it. Yeah.
Well, I mean, I'm just reading some of the stuff that XL Bully Watch have put out, arguments against the XL Bully. They argue that they're pit bulls. Analysis each pedigree shows that the American Bully is a pit bull on paper. Another argument is that they're inbred. The breed's genetic diversity is relatively limited. All current American bullies are descendants of a handful of breeders active in the early 1990s. They also argue that they are genetically aggressive. A significant number of these breeding dogs are kin to those infamous for producing human aggressive progeny. Despite this alarming lineage, such breeding dogs are extensively utilized in the United Kingdom. What do you say to that?
I think it speaks to the ineffectiveness of the legislation, right? That these are a type of pit, or they're bred from a pit, which is one of the four banned breeds from 1991. And so breeders at the time found a loophole and very much ran with it to continue breeding what was effectively a banned dog. So that was one of the first failings of this legislation, I suppose. Um, but as for whether or not these dogs are aggressive by breed, I think there are certainly almost all dog behaviorists would agree that um, there are breeds that are prone towards certain behaviors. That's how you get gun dogs that are trained for retrieving uh,
I
shot
have a gun
birds
dog
on shoots,
myself.
for
Yeah.
example. Oh, there you go. But with all of these breeds, there are healthy outlets for these behaviors. So, for example, some dogs just like carrying things around in their mouths or shaking them, and these are healthy outlets for behaviors that aren't inherently aggressive unless misdirected towards a human based upon any number of factors that could have led towards aggression. And I think, yeah, I'll leave it there for now.
So I mean, you've identified that these are descendants of a pit bull. That on paper they are pit bulls, and clearly breeders have identified that there is a need for this dog breed. There's a demand for them. So why do you think people like and own XL bullies?
It's a really good question. And so, for context, I used to work at the RSPCA for a few years. I was an animal care assistant. And so, not only did I see a lot of these dogs in person and work with a lot of these dogs, but I also saw the legislation in action. And so, as for why people love these dogs, all I can really say is from my own experiences with them is that, like any dog, they're fiercely loyal, they're fiercely lovable. Maybe fiercely is not the best use of
Yeah,
word.
probably not when we're talking about a dog breed that's murdered 14 people murdered 14 people last year, maybe.
Absolutely. So, but they are, you know, I would go into kennels with them, I would take them on walks, and we'd have absolutely no issues with, I can say in my own experience, it's very anecdotal. Every single one of those dogs who came in, and whether they were um, one of the banned breeds who would be put down, I never had a single issue with any of them, or an XL bully who at the time were lawful, uh, allowed to be rehomed. I never had a single issue with any of them. And what I actually saw was these lovely dogs, sometimes coming in as puppies when, we have the opportunity to train them and to develop, very healthy habits and very healthy behaviors, um, where they exhibit absolutely no signs of aggression or even precursors to aggression like anxiety or reactiveness. And we'd get to know these dogs, and then the police would come in, they'd look at the dog, and based on arbitrary characteristics, based on, um, visual perception of measurements, visual perception of like the shape of their jaw, would determine whether or not that dog gets to live. And it was really heartbreaking, and it was a determining factor for me quitting my job there. Actually, I just couldn't handle the emotional burden of having to put down healthy dogs, based purely on these arbitrary characteristics. Dogs that, I could vouch for very personally. Um, and I've got a really good example of this. We had one dog come in. Um, they were running around the street, they were jumping on cars, and the dog warden caught them, brought them to our rescue, and they went into a kennel. And it was determined they might be one of these type 1 aggressive dogs, one of these banned breeds. And so the police came in and they looked at the dog, whose name was Dexter, lovely young 2-year-old dog, perfectly healthy, perfectly good behavior, clearly an irresponsible owner or caregiver potentially to let them run around jumping on cars, but that was being dealt with through existing legislation. But the police came in and they determined that Dexter was one of these banned breeds, had Dexter put to sleep, and then less than a week later, we had the biological mother of Dexter come in, Misty, who was clearly, similar type of dog because Dexter was their offspring. And the police came in, looked at Misty, and they determined that she was not a banned breed. Even though visually they looked almost identical, same color, same shaped head, similar size, obviously a bit older, graying potentially, but equally lovely. And she got to live. And that speaks to the arbitrary nature of this. And
100%.
certainly,
I mean that's an awful story. How was that sort of, how were they not able to see? Because surely if they were looking at the surely when if they were identified this dog as being Dexter's mother, surely they could then look at the sort of the genetic templates, if you will, and be able to see that hang on, if this dog's getting put down, then surely this dog should be put down as well. From that sort of perspective, obviously we don't want dogs to be killed. What do you say to that?
yeah, absolutely. And that's part of the problem is, with this legislation, they say they look at these variety of metrics, including lineage. But realistically, what it comes down to is the individual doing the analysis on the day. Um, and there's a lot of room for human error in there. But yeah, and potentially human bias as well, right? And when there's this media frenzy against a certain breed or against certain dogs, then those making the decision also feel somewhat responsible. And so what we've seen is people erring on the side of caution, I suppose, not wanting to make a mistake and then rehome a dog and then have an incident later, and you follow the paper and it's like, who's responsible for this? Um, and so what we've seen is since the legislation came in, obviously we've seen it hasn't reduced attacks or fatalities, but what it has done is thousands of dogs have needlessly been put to sleep without taking into account their character, and solely based upon these biases we have against certain breeds.
So, I mean, obviously, with the conversation that we're having at the moment, we've clearly identified. Sorry, let me start that bit again. So, since the ban has been proposed and is starting to be introduced, we keep seeing XL bully owners bring up this idea of, it's not bad dogs, it's just bad owners. What do you say to that?
Yeah, I think it's more complex than that. Um, I think when they refer to bad owners, we're talking about, the really bad, um, kind of seedy, the very stereotypical like seedy criminal underworld of like dog fighting.
Okay.
And I think there's like strong elements of classism as well associated with how people perceive these certain dogs and their caregivers. So it's not as simple as saying there's no such thing as an irresponsible or a bad owner or caregiver, because there certainly is, and you can't identify them just off the street, and you can't identify them by their dog either, right?
Yeah.
And what makes a bad caregiver isn't just whether or not the dog's going to be aggressive. You'll often find, for me and the things I saw at the RSPCA, the vast majority weren't dogs coming in because they were aggressive. It was because they were neglected or abused. So there's certainly irresponsible caregivers, bad caregivers out there. As for whether there's bad dogs, I don't have the heart to say bad dog to any of their faces. But there's certainly dogs that push boundaries of behaving. But there's never been a dog that I haven't seen a trainer or a behavioralist able to rehabilitate. And I fostered several dogs, and I used to joke I live on a council estate in York, and I often come home with dogs who require muzzles. Sometimes dogs who would have been used in fighting, like Akitas, and no one has ever, if there's a burglary on the street, no one's ever touched my house because I'm coming and going with these big, scary type dogs. But
Scary dog privilege.
all of them, whatever issues they had when they came to me, it was something I was able to work out, whether it was dog aggression or aggression towards small animals or children. It was there were very clear reasons for that behavior, and we could often identify them. And once you do that, you can work on it. And I genuinely had some of the loveliest dogs leave my care and go on to full-time permanent homes where they've managed to live, extremely happy lives peacefully without harming themselves or harming anyone. And they were given that opportunity because they weren't banned breeds, even though they potentially um, could have been. Akita's one of the banned breeds is a type of Akita, and so certainly in some countries, I believe Akitas are banned. So, Saskia, my foster dog, I had her for a year. She was lucky to get that chance. And she lived to like the age of 14 very happily in a home near Newcastle. And I'm really happy for that. And it breaks my heart that um, a significant number of XL bullies, because of this legislation being brought in, also very rapidly brought in. And I think that's part of the kind of the emotional, the elevated emotions behind it and the reactionary nature of the legislation is that it's being rapidly pushed through. And a lot of dogs are going to be caught up in that. Some will have inevitably been put to sleep when the government offered money to have that as an option for caregivers. Um, and that's sad.
Yeah, so the government offered them around £200 in compensation, but from what I understand, you apply for an exemption certificate through a local authority, and the majority of exemption certificates have been approved. So surely it's just a case of, right, you submit an exemption certificate and then you get to keep your dog, and then you take the precautions that have been laid out by the government, right?
Yeah, absolutely. On paper, that sounds really simple. But I think it's highly stressful, and it's not necessarily simple in terms of implementing that process. People have personal circumstances, might get overwhelmed with the stress of it, panic about the deadlines, miss deadlines, and or just um, be caught up in the stigma around it as well. We've heard that people have been sent death threats on one side. I don't doubt that there will be people on the other side potentially, having very strong emotional responses to people who continue to keep XL bullies. And some people just probably won't want to deal with the pressure or the the stress and the biases against them. And it's great that people are applying for the exemptions, and it's great that they're being approved. And I really hope that the majority of people are able to. I believe the deadline is the end of this month.
Yeah, 31st of January.
Yeah, in
It's
time.
interesting that you mentioned with the stress dealing with the exemptions, because we're seeing reports in the media of people taking their XL bullies to Scotland to avoid them being put under any restrictions. Do you think that this is a good idea, or is it just creating a problem for Scotland that it doesn't need right now?
So I've not seen, I could be wrong here, but I've not seen examples of people taking their XL bullies to Scotland, because presumably they would either be rehoming them in Scotland, in which case at the moment it's legal to rehome them in the UK, at least for now, or England and Wales. But taking them to Scotland, the examples I've seen is volunteers from like shelters rescuing them from animal shelters and taking them to shelters in Scotland. Because the problem is when the ban comes into force, which actually I think the ban for rehoming was in force and now has been
Yeah,
delayed.
on the 31st of December, that's when it was introduced, and then from the 1st of February, that will be when the sort of the tougher restrictions come in.
Exactly. So from the 31st of December, there was this huge fear that any typed dog, any dog that was determined to be an XL bully currently in shelters is rehomable. That's regardless of, there's not an option to get a court exemption. These rescue shelters can't go to the courts and say, I have this lovely dog. They're just not able to rehome them. And so that's where you get this example of police coming in and mandating them to be put to sleep. And so that was the examples I saw of like volunteers getting them out of shelters in England, getting them shelters in Scotland, which isn't, it's not an ideal solution. I wouldn't say it's creating too much of an additional burden on Scotland. Sanctuaries are already at breaking points, and that's across the UK, and that speaks to a wider issue with irresponsible ownership and excessive breeding. And you also spoke about earlier how XL Bully Watch, I think it was, said that the XL Bully, but another reason for it to be banned is like on welfare grounds, that there's very little genetic variability in the breed, and there are health issues associated with that. That's not exclusive to XL Bullies. And arguably, there are breeds that have a much worse time of it based on desirable traits. French bulldogs are a very popular example. When I was at the RSPCA, we had one who we had to give them an operation. We had to give them a facelift because of their folds just kept getting infected, and that was even when we were wiping them every day with like anti septic wipes. And they can't breathe, and their brains are too big for their skulls, and they're in enormous pain all the time. So yeah, breeding is this bigger issue, I think, and arguably addressing things like dog ownership and breeding and tackling it in a more holistic way could also reduce stigma against certain breeds, but also reduce aggression in dogs if we understand them better and if we also understand why the behaviors of some breeds that can lead to aggressive behaviors.
Yeah, I should note that XL bully dogs are going to be banned in Scotland after owners. Here, I'll pull up the independent article. XL bully dogs to be banned in Scotland after owners cross border to beat new rules. That was about 20 hours ago from the time that we were recording. You mentioned with sort of French bulldogs, and did you mention that they were a more aggressive dog? Was that what you said? Sorry, I didn't quite hear that.
No, the issue with them is breeding and like the health issues of just they are, bless them, they're through no fault of their own, they're so inbred. Their brains are too big for their skulls. They've got folds everywhere. They get infected on their face, for example. They struggle to breathe. You take them, you see them walking down the street, and they sound like
They're
they're
wheezing.
close to having an asthma attack.
Yeah. It's a bit like with pugs. I remember about 5 years ago there was someone that I was seeing, and she had two pugs, and they were lovely dogs, but they were clearly not well in terms of not because they were being neglected. It was just because, I mean, you look at a pug. I mean, like the snout is too short, their chest is too big, their legs are too little. And I remember this dog at one point slipping, like falling over, and it looked like it was convulsing, like it was having some sort of heart attack with some sort an issue similar. And I was there in the living room. What the fuck is going on? Like, this dog is not in a good way. And then the owner sort of came in and they're like, honestly, he just does that. And I can't help but feel that having a dog breed like that it's unnecessarily cruel. And I know that people said, well, they look cute, but their eyes are like bulging out of their skulls. And that sort of brings me on to this next question. Do you think I think we've identified that there does need to be more regulation around dog ownership and also with dog breeding. So with Animal Rising, what do you guys suggest?
Yeah, so we're very interested more broadly in society's treatment of animals in general and what we call a broken relationship with animals and nature. Um, and it lends itself very clearly, or it's very explicitly clear in our food system, where we have billions of animals confined to factory farms, um, chickens who are bred to grow so quickly they can't support their own weight, pigs going to slaughter and put in gas chambers and then a bolt gun through the head. These really brutal practices that don't reflect our values as a country of people who claim to love animals. But you can also see it with, I guess, any form of pet ownership, but especially with dogs and breeding, where um, certain breeds become popular based on aesthetic reasons, and people, they claim to love dogs, but they don't actually consider what we're putting dogs through.
Yeah.
And I think the breeding industry is a perfect example of this. It's massively blown up since COVID, but it was an issue before where we had, puppy farms, um, and people profiting massively off animals, which is what it all comes down to, at the expense of the animals themselves. And people buy dogs because they love them, but really, when shelters are a breaking point and there are so many dogs that need rescuing, why are we going and spending £1,000 on a dog that's bred so intensely that they struggle to breathe or walk, just because they look cute?
Yeah.
And so that's what we talk about or that's what we mean when we talk about this broken relationship with animals and nature. And so, as for a solution around that, I think absolutely more regulation. Um, we've seen legislation try to tackle puppy farming, but it just doesn't work. When I was at the RSPCA, we had I think around 20 cockapoo puppies come in, so a mix of a cocker spaniel and poodles, really popular, very trendy dog, and they'd been kept. I remember the news article, they'd been kept like pigs. And so they'd been seized by the RSPCA. They were being kept in actual pigsties, in farrowing crates, in a pig shed, basically, in conditions that are perfectly legal to keep pigs, bear in mind, but not dogs. And so we rescued them. The people who were breeding them got taken to court. We won, thankfully, but the dogs themselves, they came in emaciated, covered in muck, and this isn't an isolated incident. This is happening across the UK, and the regulate like organizations just don't have the capacity. Police don't have the capacity to clamp down on it appropriately. So one of the things I regularly see floated is something like dog licenses. These were obviously around, I think, until like the late 80s, and were phased out shortly before the Dangerous Dog Act. And it wasn't perfect. It wasn't a perfect system. I think a major issue was actual enforcement. I think fewer than 50% of people actually who had dogs actually had licenses. But there's no reason we couldn't improve and implement such a scheme. Though actually, it's quite popular when people are surveyed as a solution. And when organizations like the Kennel Club, who oversee a lot of breeding, come out against it, it's very clear why, because it would prevent a lot of backyard breeding. It would massively diminish that industry, and which is actually an industry that's been banned in some countries, because we don't need to be breeding dogs if we really want to have an animal companion and care for an animal companion. there's better ways to show that love and care than having them bred into existence. Just go to a shelter. There's so many lovely, perfectly well-behaved dogs. I know there's a lot of stigma about shelter dogs, not being safe around kids or other animals, but really, what we're seeing, and with XL Bullies is a good example potentially, when there's no guarantee that dogs coming from breeders are going to be well behaved or exhibit no signs of harmful behaviors. And what it all comes down to is training. And I believe there was a study as well that showed that a big determinant in dog aggression is actually training received by breeders or treatment received at that stage before they're even homed. And when we've got these big breeders, especially puppy farms, they don't have time to socialize these animals. They don't have time to encourage them to exhibit healthy behaviors. And you come out with what are effectively behaviorally stunted dogs through no fault of their own, which puts a lot of a burden on the caregivers who take them on. And actually, um, in shelters. So it's often the case, even though they are brimming and at breaking point, they get a lot more socialization, and they're with people who are trained to um, encourage the animals to exhibit healthy behaviors and healthy characteristics.
I mean, yeah, I mean that was really fascinating to hear. So you mentioned the Kennel Club. Are you saying that that's sort of it's a pressure group, right? Or it's just an organization, isn't it?
Yeah, I believe they monitor and regulate like how breeders basically. So they have a lot of statistics on how many of each breed of dog are bred, and they manage like the pedigree and certificates for pedigree and things like that. That are the reason people can profit thousands um, off of harmful breeding practices.
You mentioned the increase in puppy farms, especially during COVID, and people buying dogs and raising them during lockdown. Do you think the reason that we're seeing an increase, particularly with XL bully attacks, is because these dogs have basically been raised in lockdown? They haven't had that sort of secondary socialization with other dogs necessarily. And so now that we're seeing an increase in attacks, it's just because they are sort of emotionally stunted in a way. What would you say to that?
I think that would be a very fair assessment. I'm sure there'll be behaviorists out there who disagree potentially, but it's definitely something I've seen going about online. Um, and I think it would make a lot of sense. And as for why, I know you mentioned the statistic earlier with the a disproportionate number of these attacks have come from XL bullies. I think we've also seen a disproportionate number of XL bullies bred into existence through lockdown and since lockdown. And this speaks to kind of the trends that we go through with certain breeds. Like French bulldogs were very popular. Then you had like cockapoos had their time, and I think XL bullies potentially, especially XL bully puppies, they're adorable, and that you go through these trends. So there's probably more XL bullies who don't have the appropriate training or the appropriate socialization that could account for these attacks. Absolutely.
So you mentioned obviously that the dogs, when XL bullies are puppies, they look cute, and I think we could attest that to sort of all dogs when they're puppies. But obviously when they grow, I mean, some of these dogs are growing to what, sort of 80, 90 kilos. They look like, or like hellhounds from Greek mythology. That if I was to imagine what a hellhound would look like, I would imagine a dog that looks like an XL bully. You sort of we've sort of talked about owners, and obviously the XL bully sort of our Save Our Bullies campaign has been very big on social media. We've seen them try and organize sort of dog walks with bullies, but in some cases the walks have been cancelled because of fears that the dogs will kick off. Surely that doesn't help the idea that this is a really sort of friendly, tame breed, and actually, well, maybe this is a dog that does need to be restricted. What would you say to that?
Yeah, I mean, I've not seen those reports, but obviously it's not going to help in this incredibly polarized media environment. But I think um, you put any dog in a highly stressful environment surrounded by other dogs, especially dogs that haven't been appropriately socialized because maybe they grew up during COVID, and you're going to have issues. Like just walking down the street, right? If yeah, I don't know if you've ever walked down the street with dogs, you'll have
Yeah.
they'll kick off at each other. You don't even need to have a dog to have seen that probably. Um, and that's there's going to be it's inevitable, I guess. And so put all of those dogs together in one big space probably isn't the smartest idea for any breed of dog. Um, and certainly not at a time when there's a lot of media attention focused on them, and probably as well quite a hostile media environment because of the emotive nature of this debate. It sells papers.
Yeah, I mean, we've seen with the sort of the emotive side of things, something that I've noticed XL Bully owners doing on social media is creating AI artwork of their dogs. Was wondering, do you think that that sort of thing helps? Because I'm guilty of this. I will say this. I look at that artwork and I laugh because I find it funny. And I know that other people find it funny as well. Do you think in terms of trying to convince people that this is a good dog breed and that they don't deserve to have these restrictions, that creating stuff like that almost kind of takes the mick out of their cause? What would you say to that?
Yeah, well, I smiled and laughed a little bit because I saw one of your TikToks on this,
Uh-huh.
and I did enjoy it. um, yeah, I think it's an interesting tactic. I mean, as for whether it helps or hinders the cause, I really don't know. I think different things appeal to different people. And certainly on my social media, I saw one of them, I think the one with the rainbow.
Yeah, I've seen that one. My favorite one, and I'll show it to the camera, but we'll show it on the screen. It's Jesus holding an XL bully. And what I find really funny about this image is that Jesus has got a sleeve tattoo. Yeah.
Amazing.
I mean, I can't. But this is the thing. I mean, like, as someone who has been sort of politically involved properly over the last sort of 3 years, and there's a lot of campaigns and a lot of causes that are very close to my heart, particularly sort of fair pay and working conditions, but for all public sector workers in this country, the rights of migrants because of my own background. I wouldn't create AI artwork or something like that because I would think, well, that's just going to take the piss out of my cause. So surely there's somebody within the XL Bully campaigns coordinating this, and surely they know that stuff like this isn't going to help them, but they still do it.
You know what? That's a really interesting thought because my perception of this movement behind the XL Bully is that it's actually very grassroots. You do have organizations like the RSPCA and the Blue Cross and Battersea Dogs Home kind of teaming up and speaking out against this at a very kind of national lobbyist level, certainly lobbying the government. But I think a significant amount of the campaign is grassroots. Um, and actually a different demographic potentially to the usual um the campaigns that I'm used to seeing, especially like around the environment that's very young and very motivated and very organized. Whereas the XL Bully, I guess you could call it a movement, the movement behind the XL Bullies seems much more decentralized, much less organized. And I wouldn't be surprised if, each of those art pieces was designed by or was put into a system by a different person and then shared, and they went viral
Yeah.
for whatever reason.
It's interesting you mentioned with the AI artwork that's getting shared because one of the ones that I've seen is a lot of them referencing Rishi Sunak. There's ones of him sort of sitting there looking very menacing, sleeves rolled up, blood all over his hands, and calling him a dog killer. Do you feel like this is going to be something that hinders Rishi Sunak and the Tories' election chances at the next election, banning XL bullies?
That's an excellent question. At this point, what's not hindering Rishi Sunak at the next election, right? Um, I don't, I don't know, because it's really hard for me to judge the public perception on this. It is very polarized. It's hard to tell how many people really are in the middle and are persuadable because you have a very vocal minority who are like outraged at or maybe it's not a minority, but you've got a very vocal group who are outraged at this legislation, and you've got people who are fighting tooth, blood, and nail to support it and back it and believe it's um, crucial. But with most issues, the vast majority of people sit somewhere in the middle and either
Yeah,
don't
so
know or don't care.
This is a YouGov polling from October 2023. So it was, when it comes to a ban on American XL bullies, which of the following comes closest to what form you think that ban should take? So 53% said current owners should be allowed to keep the dogs but be required to neuter them and leash and muzzle them in public. 11% said the dogs should be seized, neutered and housed away from the public. 13% the dogs should be seized and destroyed. 4% something else, 9% don't know, and then non-applicable, I don't think there should be a ban, that's 10%. So the polling does suggest that at least sort of 53% of the country, slightly more than half, agree that there should be some restrictions in place for these dogs.
Yeah. So I think, that could in some way work in his favor. I don't think it's an election winning strategy. But certainly, agreeing they need to be neutered and muzzled is, I think, relatively, it's not what the legislation, it's not the problem with the legislation, yes, dogs don't love to wear muzzles, but you can train them to be comfortable with them. At worst, it's an inconvenience. The real issue of this legislation for me comes down to the arbitrary nature at which XL bullies will be destroyed, which, well, I could talk for hours about why that's a problematic term. But also the dogs that aren't XL bullies that will be caught up in this through no fault of their own, but also the XL bullies who are effectively, good-natured, well-trained dogs who won't be judged on their character, but will be judged on the size of their jaw, and that's the issue with this legislation, alongside the fact that it doesn't work. Right, I've spoke about this before, but dog bite incidents continue to go up, hospitalization continues to go up. Banning 4 breeds in 1991 didn't work. Banning the XL bully isn't going to work.
And with that, so you mentioned that there's obviously there's been the increase, particularly even when they introduced the 1991 Dangerous Dogs Act, there were still attacks happening. Why was that?
Well, I think it just the reason for the attacks didn't change. The reason they continued was because the legislation was ineffective. And as I mentioned before, the vast majority of dogs, maybe last year was the same because XL bullies weren't banned at the time, but the vast majority of dog attacks come from non-banned breeds. And you can't ban every breed that's ever going to take part in an attack. And so more effective initiatives that have been implemented successfully elsewhere, mind, are things like awareness campaigns and education, so we better understand dogs' needs, their behaviors, and what leads to aggression and how to avoid it. Because it's very rare that a dog will go straight from calm, happy to viciously attacking you. There's often a number of triggers leading to that point, but also they'll demonstrate behaviors that are kind of like warning signs. The same way we do as humans, body language, maybe we'll like huff as well. Like we can verbalize it a bit more, but dogs can too. They bark or they growl. And so, yeah, what we've seen in other countries that have implemented more successful legislation and campaigns to reduce dog attacks is actually they've so I'm thinking of places like the Netherlands and Italy that have repealed. So they had breed-specific legislation, realized it didn't work, and repealed it. And we've seen the same, I think, in some US states. And I'm sure the list is longer than that, but those are the ones that come to mind for me right now.
It's interesting that you just mentioned one of the things, the dogs have to wear a muzzle. Some owners, we've seen news articles here, I've got one from the Mirror of a guy wearing a muzzle in a pub, drinking his pint from a straw in solidarity with his breed. Do you think when I see stuff like that, I laugh because I find it quite absurd. Do you think, again, with people doing stuff like these sort of acts of solidarity, if you will, do they help the cause, or do they just hinder it, and people just dismiss these people as being, well, stupid, if you will?
I think anyone who's going to dismiss that is probably already less likely to be receptive to any form of protest. And this is what it is essentially. It's a type of protest, I suppose. and it's media grabbing. It's effective. We're talking about it, and yeah, it's generating awareness for an issue. We're obviously a very polarized issue at the moment, one that's going through a judicial review process as well. So it's not a shut and closed case necessarily. Um, and so actually, I think it's quite innovative. Um, and yeah, it might be, it might look a bit funny to some people, but humor in protests, I'm a big fan. We
Yeah.
can't be all doom and gloom all the time. And maybe we need to have a laugh every so often.
Again with the protest tactics, here if I can here I'll find it. It's a placard that I saw at a protest. I'm just going to read out to you. I wanted to get your thoughts on it. I'm holding you solely accountable for everything XL bully owners are doing right now. Here we go. When an XL bully type in air quotes dog attacks a child, the breed gets banned. Jimmy Savile did it and got knighted. Neuter nonces, muzzle the media, and leave our dogs alone. Do you think stuff like that helps?
Um, it's certainly provocative.
Yeah, I mean, comparing your dog to a paedophile probably isn't the best idea, is it? It's not. There are better comparisons to make, surely.
Absolutely. I'm always reluctant to, weigh in on this debate of effectiveness because it's often leveled against us at Animal Rising. Like, we run onto the track at the Grand National to protect horses from being raced to death.
And then
And
one
we're
died.
told, oh, you're just turning people off your cause by doing this. Um, but it's bigger than that, and we have to use all of the tools in our arsenal and provocative slogans, provocative placards, they're the ones that get circulated on social media. No one's going to share a picture of one that says "Don't ban XL bullies" because it's not going to make a good headline.
I mean, I guess most people will say that nonces are banned in this country. Whether the legislation in place to sort of, in terms of prison sentences, is strong enough, or whether there should be stronger sentences. That's definitely a debate for another time. Robert, I've really enjoyed having this conversation with you, and definitely, I think what you've talked about has kind of swayed my opinion on it. Definitely. Before you go, is there anything that you'd like to promote?
So yeah, and Animal Rising, one of our leading campaigns at the moment, is called Plant-Based Councils. So I mentioned before, we do a lot of work around the food system and transitioning our food system for not just the animals themselves, but also environmental reasons. And a lot of councils around the country have declared a climate emergency. And now for us, the next logical step is for them to start implementing that through their food procurement policies. So implementing plant-based transitions at a council level and having all of their meetings and their external and internal events plant-based to lead by example, show us what a climate-friendly food system can look like. And so that's the campaign we're very much focusing on at the moment. And people can get involved by going to our website, animalrising.org. And it's a really great campaign, really great fun to get involved in, and a really great way you can make change at a local level.
That sounds really good. And to all of you listening and watching, please do check out that campaign. Please do follow us on all social media. Please donate to our Patreon if you can. We really appreciate the support that you're showing. And yeah, we'll see you again for the next episode. Thank you.